Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Mulvihill, and I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas. And we are so excited for you to be with us today at our event. Welcome to The Big Idea. This is an online program that we do monthly to highlight fresh thinking and scholarship in the humanities. And we are delighted by today's presentation looking at the life and legacy of Harriet Tubman. But just as a reminder, we will have time for questions and answers throughout the presentation. So if you'll be sure and put that in the chat box or in the Q&A boxes, we'll be looking at both of those throughout today's event. Now, each big idea begins with a short essay and that's created by our featured speaker. And that usually includes additional resources that you can check out on your own, whether those might be books or articles or films or essays, whatever it might be. And these are intended to help spark a conversation. Our hope is that you take these resources, you take the essay, you take today's conversation, and take it with you to your next dinner party or gathering with friends or hike in the woods and really have a conversation about why we need to know about this particular subject matter. Again, we really encourage you to take this big idea to spark a conversation among your friends and family. So to begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who's our host for today. She will introduce and interview our special guest. Dr. Mendoza is Director of Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. She's a native Kansan and earned a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Valerie, and take it away.
Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everyone. So glad you all are here with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kim Carey Warren. She is Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Social Welfare and Associate Professor of History at the University of Kansas. She's also the author of The Quest for Citizenship, African American and Native American Education in Kansas, 1880 to 1935. And this month she wrote our big idea on Harriet Tubman, Freedom's Conductor. Welcome, Kim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Valerie, for having me. It's always a pleasure. And it's a pleasure to talk to you specifically, but it's also a pleasure to talk about humanities in Kansas and about Kansas. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so let's just jump right in. So for those of us who didn't get a chance to read your big idea or want to learn a little bit more, can you tell us about Harriet Tubman's early years? Like she's best known for being a conductor of the Underground Railroad, right? But tell us a little bit about how she got there. And I should say it's the anniversary of her birth, correct?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned the birth because so what we know about Harriet Tubman is that she was an enslaved woman. Before the Civil War, she was enslaved, and she got to a point where she needed to leave. She needed to free. She thought she was going to be sold south, further south, away from her family, into what I think in the decade before the Civil War was perceived to be a harsher, more violent kind of slavery. And so she decided to liberate herself. So let me, but what she's known for is not necessarily her own liberation. It's the fact that once she ran away from her enslaved place in Maryland, I think her place of freedom, the first place she got to was Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in particular. But she went back. That's what we know her. We know her for someone who went back several times, maybe 10, 20 times, rescued somewhere in the hundreds, maybe 300 people. But what I'd like to also talk about are the ways that she allowed for further freedom even after that. But you asked about her early life first, so let's talk about that just briefly. And you asked about her birth, and when I talk to my students about ways in which people liberate themselves. One of the things that I think is important for all of us to remember is that knowing when we were born is actually, it's a privilege. It ought to be a right. It probably is a right. Maybe it's written down somewhat. Maybe it's a human right. But certainly before the Civil War and before the 13th Amendment and before the emancipation of slaves, a lot of enslaved people didn't know when they were born what their actual birth date was, let alone who their biological parents were. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. So we have these kind of estimated moments for different people. And I think what I like to remind people of is that although the birth date is significant, if we know that about a person, what's even more significant is how the enslaved person, once in freedom, renames himself or herself. The renaming is almost like this second birth, right? It's this moment where they claim their own humanity. They certainly, like Harriet Tubman, had already reclaimed her humanity in a number of ways by actually getting married to a freed man, by maintaining a relationship with her father, her mother, keeping track of her siblings, things like that. But in the moment of freedom, where a person who, as enslaved, went by Araminta Ross. So Araminta was the name that her mother probably gave her. She went by Minty, and Ross would have been the name of the slaveholder. As a freed woman, she said, "I'm taking the name of my husband, Tubman, and I'm going to rename myself Harriet after my grandmother." So that's part of the background. There's some other things that we know about Harriet Tubman, that she, as a young girl, maybe as a teenager, she was injured quite severely with a head wound, and that caused future and I think fairly frequent episodes, they called them, or these episodes that might have been something like an epileptic episode, or a moment where she was dizzy or had visions or something, but this brain injury persisted throughout her life as well. So those are some of the things that we know about Harriet Tubman. If we watch, I rewatched the movie Harriet just the other day, and I was also reminded in that version of her story, they recount the wills that passed Harriet's family as property through the Ross family. And in the movie, it depicts this historical moment where Harriet's mother was supposed to be freed at the age of 45, and therefore children of Harriet's mother, including Harriet Tubman herself, were supposed to be freed. And they actually tried to figure out how to use the legal system to enforce that. And it's a moment that reminds us that even when legally there is a definition of freedom for an individual, it doesn't always manifest. The legal system doesn't always support that. The people who there are barriers to using the legal system to enforce that freedom and so forth. So those are some of the things I think about in her earlier life.
Yeah. And it seems like as you were talking, I was thinking, wow, these early experiences must have informed, her desire for escape, right? Desire to be free, because you can't rely on the legal system. You can't rely on the promises of white masters, right? So I'm going to emancipate myself. And then I want to help emancipate my family members who are supposed to be free by all rights, So walk us through, the Underground Railroad and Tubman's involvement in all this? And like, do we even know how the Underground Railroad got started in the first place? I was thinking about that, and I'm like, I know it exists, but like, where did this all come from?
Sure. I mean, I think, when we learn about the Underground Railroad, sometimes we like to think about it as a system of well-organized depots, which would have been hiding places or people's houses, well-organized maps and routes and so forth. I think that it's more accurate to think about the Underground Railroad as something that developed out of a series of conversations and out of a series of shared knowledge about individual white people and Black people who were willing to help people escape to freedom. So there were societies, there were visible, organized, overt societies, freed people societies that existed to help formerly enslaved people. But we also, but a lot of the Underground Railroad, I think what really was a series of people who were willing to have hiding places in their barns, in their bedrooms, where they would have like a sort of an attic in the bedroom, and they would move the bed in front of the hole, during the day so nobody could see it. And then the enslaved people would travel to the next place at night. There, we in Quindaro, which is, in Kansas City, Kansas, a place that became Western University, a school, is known to have had Underground Railroad stops, where enslaved people, especially coming from Missouri, would get to Kansas and would stay there and either, continue on their journey further north or further out west. So those are some of the things that we can think about in terms of constructing the Underground Railroad. The reason it's called that is that it's about language. It's about creating a set of codes, right? So the person who's leading the escape is the conductor. The people who are escaping are passengers. There are depots, which are safe points, and so forth. So it was a way to talk about escaping and leading people to freedom, using this kind of lexicon. And I think it's really important to understand that the Underground Railroad, so if we're talking about before the Civil War breaks out in 1861, Emancipation Proclamation's 1863, but the 13th Amendment's not until 1865, which is really the federal emancipation of all slaves. So in the decades leading up to that, we need to remember that, especially with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, it was illegal in any state to help a fugitive slave.
Mhm.
So even in northern states that had, under state law, abolished slavery, this federal Fugitive Slave Act compelled individuals to not help escaped slaves, compelled them to actually bring escaped slaves back to their enslaver, or they would be breaking federal law.
And Tubman started after that act was passed, right? So that made what she was doing even more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything, her marriage wouldn't have been recognized legally. Of course, evading, her enslaved place would have been illegal. Everything that she did was illegal. And everyone who helped her, though, which is the point I'm making, everyone who helped her was engaged in, what might have been considered, what was considered illegal activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, so she started after she escaped, and then went back and helped family members emancipated them, basically guide them to freedom. And then where did they all go?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, but a lot of my guess is, not everybody made it to Canada. I think that's the sort of the legend about escaping to freedom from the American South. a lot of the, escape, like, so Harriet Tubman, her first journey was from Maryland to Pennsylvania. So, there was a northern movement, but not, it was westward as well. So folks certainly went into northern states. They certainly tried to make it to Canada, but they also, if they were in the middle of the country, so I gave the example of somebody, coming from Missouri, they would try to get to Kansas, the nearest place that could try to provide a modicum of freedom or some sort of freedom.
Yeah. As we're talking, that makes me think, and I'm thinking out loud here, about, like, if they didn't get to a place like Canada, basically they're kind of living in the shadows, right? Like living in fear of discovery, right?
Well, right. I mean, because they, so for someone like, okay, yes and no. So for someone like Tubman, what we know is there were actually arrest warrants. There were, drawings made of her. There were descriptions because her owners wanted her back. And there were people like that where the owners wanted their slaves back. I mean, I think partly because of the labor that they provided, but yeah. I think from an owner standpoint, it was they didn't want other enslaved people to feel that they could follow that. They would try to use that person who had escaped as an example, put out a warrant. There were slave hunters. There were other folks engaged in trying to find these escapees. And so, but not that, so for those folks, they probably, tried to find a way to, disappear into some sort of freed person society, or something like that. Harriet Tubman ends up joining the Union Army, basically. I mean, not joining, but helping the Union Army. And I hope we get to talk about that. Yeah, other folks probably escaped into obscurity and just sort of disappeared. There are a lot of different stories. One of the legends is that Thomas Jefferson's own children, that a couple of them were so light-skinned that they might have even disappeared into white society in Washington, D.C. or further north. So some folks we know about, but most people we don't know what happened to them after they escaped.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to get to her involvement in the Civil War, but we've talked about this, or you've mentioned this a little bit, and that's Kansas's role in the Underground Railroad. And what we tend to forget was, like, Missouri was a slave state, right? And Kansas was a free state. So we're right next door. So what do we know about Kansas's role in the Underground Railroad?
We think that there were many routes, that Missouri, was in fact a slave state. It really was not a Midwestern state. It really was a Southern state. Before the Civil War, there's certainly still some attributes of Southern society that exist today. There's a lot of evidence that white and Black people thought of Kansas as like a promised land, as a new Canaan, as a place that once they got to Kansas, freedom would endure. Kansas is the free state. I think that was relatively true for a lot of people. I don't think that was wholly true. There were still segregation, there was still discrimination, but Kansas held out as a free state and would fight off, literally, and violently fight against folks from Missouri who tried to come into Kansas to vote, to participate in elections or votes that would swing the state towards slavery before the Civil War. John Brown was in the state of Kansas in the 1850s, and who was an anti-slavery crusader. And we see him in the Kansas State House, with the gun in one hand and the Bible in the other. And and I think in some ways those two polar images are really important to hold on to, because as heroic as we might think of as anti-slavery crusades, he was incredibly violent and killed people in the name of anti-slavery, and then ultimately was captured in 1859 in Virginia and tried for treason and hanged for his efforts. But he was in Kansas before he was running throughout the rest of the country, helping people escape from slavery. So I think that there was so I think that Kansas actually has a very robust history of evidence of participation in the Underground Railroad, especially in the 1850s.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the kind of you mentioned 1859 and Harper's Ferry, and that kind of brings us up to the Civil War. And, one of the lesser known things about Tubman, or maybe I should just say I didn't know, that she, as you said, helped the Union Army and was actually, some people called her a spy. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is this is newish. I don't know if it's new information actually, but I think this is the aspect of her life and her career that is becoming more amplified in the scholarship and even in popular magazines and newspapers and so forth. And I think it's really important to amplify. I think it's incredibly amazing and important to honor Harriet Tubman's bravery of going back and forth, freeing people, risking her own life, risking the lives of escaped people over and over again. I think that is incredibly important. But I think what's more important, and I think our responsibility in the modern day, is to recast her and frame her entire life as a campaign for freedom, and not just her own, but others as well. So she is involved very intimately in these escapes. But when the war breaks out, she's a woman. So that's why I kind of dialed back and said she didn't really join the Union Army because they wouldn't let her, right?
Yeah.
She's a woman. But here's somebody who actually, and there are a number of women like this, and there were a number, there were Black male soldiers who were able to join, even if they were escaped enslaved people, they could join the Union Army. But here's a woman who had gained vast knowledge of the landscape and how to, physically navigate in covert ways through her previous experiences of freeing people. So as a spy, she was able to inform Union soldiers and officers about how to, where the Confederate Army could do things, where they could move, how they could move, where they were moving. Her most celebrated mission was when she actually not only informed but led a troop of white Union soldiers, and basically the covert mission culminated in destroying a bridge. Okay, so now the Confederate Army couldn't move around, but then they also destroyed other Confederate properties and other things. So there was this way in which this one operation helps us see her as a leader, as somebody who's informing, as somebody who's organizing using the knowledge that she has. She in that moment becomes a military tactician. This destruction of property actually has an important strategic advantage for the Union, and it also creates an opportunity for a number of enslaved people to emancipate themselves, to actually run to freedom, to join the Union, and to escape where they were. So this is really significant that, and so just to see her as an escaped slave is one thing, but to see Harriet Tubman as somebody who didn't give up, who really continued to, yeah, great. Okay. So this is the Harper's Ferry raid of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. Okay.
Yeah, so this raid was just so important that Harper's Weekly, this national magazine, has a depiction of it. So it's not one of those raids that we learn about. That's not like Vicksburg or Gettysburg or some of those other ones, but it was super important at the time. And part of this depiction, you can see some, slaves running to freedom, and yeah.
And what would have been so I think this was published, is it 18? I can't see at the top. It says July 4,
1860 something. That's 3.
Yeah. And I don't know if we, and I do, so I see in the depiction, it looks like female bodies, male bodies, but they look like, enslaved people running. So we don't see, what we don't see in that depiction, is a Black woman who's responsible for this, leading this effort. Now, what is interesting is that it wasn't unknown, although we're talking about now in 2022, and you and I, Valerie, are, we're historians, and this, we've been teaching about the Civil War, at some point in any of our classes for many, many years. And we both admitted that this is relatively newish information to us. Well, it wasn't hidden, because there, for example, you're giving this example, like the raid itself was documented in popular culture. And in the 1970s, a group of Black women, actually Black women lesbians, who were not finding that they found a voice in the feminist movement, they created their own statements about feminism and the way that they wanted to empower themselves. And they called themselves the Combahee River Collective. And the significance of that is that raid that we just saw, that we've just been talking about, was on the Combahee River. So folks have known about the significance of the raid. Folks have known the significance of Harriet Tubman's role in that. I think that, in the modern moment, we have a more collective responsibility to amplify that part of Tubman's history. Part of the reason is it's not just her. If she was doing these things, certainly she was extraordinary, but she was not the only woman. She was not the only Black woman who was engaged in these efforts of freedom before the war and after and during the war.
Yeah, I think it's so important that her legacy was recognized by this really progressive, important group of Black feminists in the in the 70s. Over 100 years later, you and I were talking, and I mentioned that the National Women's Studies Association in 2017 dedicated their whole conference to the Combahee River Collective. That's just how important that movement was in the 70s, and then we can trace it all the way back to Tubman, and I think that's so cool.
Yeah, and I think this is, since we're thinking about sort of moments in history and how that connects to bigger ideas, and perhaps it connects to the larger, to the present moment. I always get worried that that when we celebrate one particular woman or one particular person, that yes, it's important to celebrate that person, absolutely. But I never want us to stop there. I want us to think, okay, there must have been others. I hope that when we get into the nuanced history of a person's life and their longstanding systemic contributions to American history, I hope that makes us, try to look for others. But I also hope it makes us think about, who are the modern Harriet Tubmans? So we don't, thank goodness, have people trying to emancipate themselves from enslavement, but we do still have numbers of, I think about, mothers who are trying to make sure that their kids have good access to decent schools and to good health care. And I think about how there are still numbers of people who know that there are laws that could protect them, but don't have access to laws to actually, to enact that protection. And then I also think about like this lifelong history, this lifelong battle of Harriet Tubman, and how she never would have had the language about the difference between, everyday racism and systemic racism. She wouldn't have had that language. But in fact, she was really trying to fight for systemic change by, actually, joining in the Union Army's efforts and trying to make change there. By, after the war's over, she ends up helping elderly people. She ends up opening up a home for elderly people. So like real, like this kind of systemic care for other people. The other thing that she does that's significant is she says, I actually helped the Union Army. I ought to get a pension. I ought to be financially
Yes.
compensated.
Yes.
And initially she gets a pension because she's a widow's pension, I believe it's what it's called. But she keeps fighting and she said, no, I actually did something too. I need to be recognized and compensated. And to me, that is such a significant effort to make systemic change, to make the systems change, not just the individual people that she was interacting with. So ultimately, she did get her own pension from the Union Army.
Absolutely. I love how, she doesn't rest on her laurels, of freeing these people. She is the spy. And then, afterwards, when that's over, she helps, even more people, like you were mentioning, in their old age. And then, I think when you were talking about fighting for a pension, that reminded me of what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, right? And about how, the legal system did not help her and her family to freedom when they were enslaved. But then, through her tenacity and, just sheer force of will, that she was able to get that pension. So I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to that in 1 second. There's just one other piece that I really wanted to talk to Kim about, and that was a different form of Harriet Tubman's legacy. Her legacy today, particularly in pop culture. And so we have let's start with the quilt. We have an image of a quilt from a local quilt maker, and I'll let you tell everybody about that.
And I think we have an image so that everybody can see that. Here it comes. Yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks for bringing that up. So so there's a local artist who I have just met over email named Marla Jackson. And when she found out, and she might even be on this call, when she found out that I was talking about Harriet Tubman today, she said, I've actually created this quilt. It's called Harriet. We just switched over images. Let's go back to. There it is. There it is. This amazing quilt. And I said, let's share it with people online. So this is, if you can see at the bottom, it's called Harriet Tubman, 2010 creation made out of cotton fabric and other fabrics and buttons and acrylic paint. You can see in the figure in her skirt, you can see words like slaves. You can see, these numbers. You could imagine that these that, I mean, I'm not an art historian, but I'm imagining that, in this creation, part of the clothing represents the people who Harriet Tubman helped to emancipate. In the background, we see cotton. So one of the largest crops that was produced in the American South, and it was such a large crop that it created a bigger and bigger and bigger demand for enslaved labor. So we see that. We see in the bottom left panel, I'm imagining, the dark kind of background that this symbolizes folks who were escaping under the cover of night. So in Harriet Tubman's experience of emancipating people, most of her work would have been done at night, a lot of hiding during the day and a lot of navigating and moving around and going to the next hiding place during the night. So this is just a really beautiful tribute. And I really appreciate Marla Jackson sending it and sharing it with us to help us remember that, these folks from the past are still a part of us. And I also wonder if part of, the idea of creating a quilt is supposed to remind us, two things. It takes a lot of pieces to put a quilt together, right? Quilts are put together with a lot of different things, and we can imagine all the different pieces, all the different elements of Harriet Tubman's life that had to come together and that she had to bring together in order to emancipate people herself, and then also work for the systemic change. But the other thing that the quilt reminds me of is how important quilts were in the Project of Freedom. So quilts, there were certain patterns that were used. They were, the quilts were made and then they were hung out on the lines, at people's houses, so that visibly there was sort of this way of sending messages to people who were trying to escape or trying to navigate along the Underground Railroad. They would see particular quilts with particular patterns, and that would give them information about where the next safe house would be, if that place was a safe house, things like that. So there's also a whole history of the role of quilts in particular, and these kinds of blankets and the way that they help with the Emancipation Project. Yeah. Oh, and I see that we have a link to Marla Jackson's website. So thanks for showing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I was asking you about, and again, we'll get to your questions after this, was, Tubman and pop culture. And we were talking and you said you actually Googled Harriet Tubman songs. Yeah. And we found some. So we want to share with you a clip from one of the songs. So we'll just cue that up.
Yeah, let's cue that up and do maybe the first 2 minutes of it, and then we'll talk a little bit. So we're not having audio, we've got the video.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun, weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear
100 miles to freedom? Would you like to pick a new name to mark your freedom?
Harriet Tubman.
Early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine, we're gonna start moving towards that separating line. I'm waiting through my
Thank you. That was so powerful. So let's explain to everybody what we were watching.
So that is a video that that was produced, I believe, by the movie makers of the movie Harriet that came out a few years ago. So Cynthia Erivo was the main actor in that movie. I think she might have written that song, but certainly we see
She
her
did, yeah.
And then what I liked about that video is that we hear the song, we see the words, and we also see the backup singers, we see we even see the soundboard being manipulated, and we see a couple clips from the movie, and there's power in the song itself, because I think that it does give a pretty thorough historical representation of Tubman's own experience, but it also reminds us that we're still in an era, we're still in an era where Black women have to say, this is what I can do in Hollywood, this is what I can do on the movie screen, listen to my voice. And so what I like about this video is that it shows the voice of Tubman, but also of Erivo and the backup singers and the producers, like people who want to say, I have something to say about this person's life, but I also have something to say about my own life and my significance in humanity. And so I really appreciated how the video was put together. There are other videos, particularly of this song of just Cynthia Erivo singing, but I thought this brought together all of those different kinds of elements that are really significant even in 2022.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I should say, I was looking this up, and she was nominated, or that song was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song in the year the film came out, which I think was 2018 or 2019. And she herself was nominated for Best Actress for playing that role. And we'll put the link for it. We had another one, but we don't have time to show you about Harriet Tubman. We'll put the link in the chat if you guys want to watch it on your own later to spark a conversation. But we talked so much, Kim, we ran out of time for questions, but thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. This was awesome.
Well, I think your questions probably represented some things that folks have been thinking about. And I really appreciate the conversation. I think you're absolutely right. Let's keep folks in conversation who are not always highlighted in American history textbooks. I would love a resumption of the conversation about someone like Harriet Tubman on our currency. And also, honestly, just keeping these stories alive in popular conversation and popular culture.
Thank you.
This was so incredible. Thank you so much, Kim and Valerie, for this really stimulating conversation. And I know that I, for one, took down quite a few notes. And one of the things that I was struck by, I think we all know it, but sometimes you have to hear it in such a straightforward way, that knowing when you were born is a privilege. And I just thought I knew it, but hearing you say it made me think about this whole presentation in a different way. And the simple fact that we know so much about Harriet Tubman's life is in and of itself a bit of a miracle. And so thank you to both of you for being historians, for being involved and interested in women's history and bringing these voices forward through your research and through your presentation. So a special thank you to both of you for that. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. What a great turnout we had. And, we always say that Humanities Kansas is leading a movement of ideas, and we're so glad that you were part of it today in every way. We hope you'll join us next year. Yes, I said next year. Can you believe it? Next month, January 26th, I believe at noon, we'll have our next Big Idea program. We'll be exploring African-American genealogy in Kansas with Sherry Camp. And Sherry is a genealogy librarian, I believe, at the Topeka-Shawnee County Public Library. So we know you won't want to miss that. So anyway, happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you next year.